Hello, and welcome to How to Land a Job from College Guidance Network. I'm your host, Michelle Weise. And I know we have a mix of students, family members, and counselors joining us tonight. And while most of our programs, including this one, are focused on the student's journey to a career, there's a lot tonight that I think is going to be really helpful to parents and others who might be in the middle of or considering a job transition. So, with that in mind, please go into the chat and tell us where you're joining from and also what your role is. Are you a parent, a student, another family member, a school counselor, an IEC? And to keep things moving smoothly and to also keep things organized for us, we really ask that you use the Q&A button on Zoom to ask your questions and try to avoid using the chat just because we kind of lose track of the questions. So if you could please use the Q&A button on your Zoom display, that's the best way to get your questions to us. Now, who better to get into how to land a job than the woman who not only writes about jobs as the Boston Globe's job doc columnist, but also helps companies find the right people to fill those jobs as the founder and CEO of First Beacon Group. Welcome, Pattie Hunt Sinacole, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Michelle. Happy to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. So, Pattie, let's start with this. I'd love to just have you first just tell us how you got into this work of matching people with the right professional roles and the right organizations. What was your journey like?
So I completed an undergrad at UMass Amherst. There was no master plan. I was really open to a number of opportunities. I was fortunate to land my first recruiting role in financial services. I wish I could say that I had planned it all with sort of a huge strategy, but really it was my first job out of college, and I was really fortunate to love my first role. And then I just moved into the HR field, and here I am.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us have kind of felt that same way, that maybe there wasn't a lot of kind of pre-mapping this all out. We've kind of had to sort of fumble our way through, and I'm hoping that tonight we can maybe reduce some of that fumbling for our folks. And we're really going to be framing the discussion tonight around four main objectives: how to search for a job, how to build your network and use it, tips for in-person and virtual interviews, and how to deal with the ups and downs of the job hunt. So when we talk about things like the search or networking or interviewing, right, we're going to be getting into the nitty gritty of LinkedIn profiles, maybe your social media profiles, job boards, how to navigate those kinds of job postings, and also how to deal with rejection. So why don't we first start with this first bullet of searching and thinking about things like resumes and job boards. I'm wondering if kind of more from a personal perspective, if you wouldn't mind sort of sharing a little bit about maybe your younger self, and is there a mistake maybe you made that you would be willing to share with the audience, or anything that you did wrong that you learned from and that helped you grow in the long run?
I'm sure I made many mistakes. And mistakes, as I think we all know or have come to know, are learning opportunities. And I think the mistake that I made early on, or one of the mistakes I made early on, was really not realizing that rejection and setbacks are part of the job search process. I think all of us have had poor interviews. All of us have had experiences where we've been rejected or haven't been called back for a final interview. And that is an opportunity to reflect and learn from that and move forward and dust yourself off and move ahead. So I think that is probably one of my earliest learnings.
Yeah, yeah. That there's a reason why, maybe, right, that perhaps that wasn't the job for us ultimately.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. How should we all be thinking about networking and the job search? What would be kind of the tip you might give us as we think about larger concept of networking? I know for younger learners, it's not entirely clear what that means.
So I have an acronym that I use. I call it ABN, and it's always be networking. And really, networking, to use the simplest definition that I know of, is really connecting or reconnecting with contacts. They may be family members, they may be former classmates, they may be professors, they may be friends, they may be someone who was your manager at a summer internship, but constantly broadening and deepening that network. They don't have to be always a former manager or always a CEO of a company. Certainly, there are lots of folks out there that can really provide information and leads on new job opportunities. So I think that's something that a lot of job hunters really don't think enough about.
What does it actually mean to network? Like, are you supposed to be kind of like trying to take people out to coffee to learn more about their industry, or what does that actually mean? Like, what does it entail?
So it could be a coffee. It could be having a long walk with someone. It could be meeting someone on Zoom or Teams. It could be connecting by phone. I know that a lot of colleges and universities have virtual networking events where you'll literally sit down at a round table and have 3 or 4 different folks, a conversation with them. And one of the things that I always recommend to job seekers is have your pitch ready. And really, a pitch is nothing more than 30, 60 seconds about who you are and what you're looking for and how that person might be able to be helpful to you.
Yeah, so I guess in that third point of how that person might be helpful to you, like, does that mean it's okay to ask for something or ask for help?
Absolutely. We're all going to need help in this life. So asking for help is fine. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about LinkedIn, but and we can talk about how to look at that person on LinkedIn and their connections. And that's sometimes a shortcut to asking them for help.
All right, perfect. Well, why don't we like maybe backtrack a little and just think about the starting point? What are some things that we should all consider when we are actually looking for a job?
So I think that the 3 boxes in my head, and I try to be very, very simple about this message. I think you have to like what you do because we're all spending typically 40 or more hours a week in this role, doing this job, so to speak. You have to be pretty good at it. You have to have some skill in that area. And then you hope that someone will pay you for it. So those are really, especially when I talk to students and recent grads about what's important, I give them that little checklist to think about if they're checking all of those 3 boxes.
Yeah. I'm wondering how a younger learner, maybe a high school student or a younger college student, is supposed to know whether they like a job in an area. Like, how do they get better exposure so that they can actually know whether this is the right direction to go?
Sure. Some of it's going to be their coursework. Some of it's going to be, I knew when I did my undergrad, I was never going to be an accountant. So one of the mantras I have with students is it's just as important to know what you like as to know what you don't like, because then you can start eliminating things from your path. I knew that I liked my organizational behavior and HR courses. I knew that I wasn't a chemistry person. So eliminating some of those is just as important as including those. And then trying out part-time jobs and summer internships, that'll tell you a lot about what your possible career paths might look like.
Yeah, so maybe those networking conversations are like a great way to get some of those internship opportunities. And is the expectation today that most internships are paid, or are there still unpaid internships now?
Most internships are paid, but that doesn't always mean that they're the most valuable. They're the most valuable to your pocketbook and your wallet for sure. but sometimes there are unpaid internships, which can develop your network, be a possible future professional reference, or just expose you to a new area or broaden your skill set.
Yeah. We're going to bring in our audience right now just for a little poll, and we're going to talk about resumes. And so we're just going to ask you all a very simple question, which is, are you proud of your resume? So, who in the audience tonight is proud of their resume? So, while people are picking their answers, Pattie, I would love to ask you, what do you think makes a great resume?
I think how I describe a resume, it's your marketing material about who you are and how you could potentially add value to an organization or to an employer. So it shouldn't include every last detail of every job you've ever held. It should be the highlights. It should be visually appealing. It should be in a reasonable font size. It should
What's a
be,
reasonable font size?
I would say for us that wear glasses for close-up reading, 11 or better
Okay.
in terms of a font size and in a readable font. I always recommend not using what I would call the wedding invitation font. That's a little bit too complicated, but some of the
Like
more
the
standard
sans
fonts.
serif kind of
Yeah,
font. Yeah.
yeah.
Interesting.
And I think it has to be crisp. I think it has to be clean. I think it has to be clear. I happen to like bullets versus a paragraph form. I think it should be free of typos. I think that you have to have someone else proof it because sometimes we always don't catch our own typos, even though we've proofed it and reread it and reread it. Suddenly, someone else looks at it and they say, hey, wait, manager versus manger, that's not right. So they'll pick up on things that maybe, even though you and I have looked at it 50 times, a fresh set of eyes is helpful.
Yeah, I know. I started off my career in academia, and CVs for academics are insanely long. They can be sometimes like 20 pages long. What would you recommend? I know that's not okay for most other industries. What would you recommend as a good? Is it one page front side only?
So front side only is definitely sort of the rule of thumb. My resume is 2 pages long. Most folks, especially students, I use the guide of if you have 10 years or fewer, you probably should be on the 1 page. If you have 10, 12 or more, you should probably be in the 2 page, but it all depends on our career histories. I mean, some people who have taken a break from the workplace or the workforce might have 1.5 pages, and that's fine. I think the content might be more important than the actual length.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, I forgot to kind of go through some of these poll results. And I think they just disappeared. But I did see the good news is that out of all, oh, there they are again. All of our participants have a resume, which is a great start. And most actually seem to be proud of them. We have 56% of our audience who are actually proud to present it, whereas, the rest of our folks think it might need a little bit of work. So that's great that we actually have one in play. And now we kind of have a few more ideas on some of those do's and don'ts. So obviously we're talking about resumes, but now with the world that we live in, we also have access to, a huge platform like LinkedIn. There are others like Handshake. I'm wondering if you think there's an age at which it seems appropriate to begin building a LinkedIn. Is there any time where you're too young maybe, or how should folks be thinking about their LinkedIn profiles and building out their professional portfolio?
So in the US, and in some countries, they have different minimums, but in the US, you're required to be 16. I jokingly say 16 in one day is what I would recommend to start building a LinkedIn profile. It doesn't have to be perfect. It won't be perfect the first time you build a LinkedIn profile. That's okay. You're going to continue to build it In fact, one of my personal practices is I look at my LinkedIn profile, my resume every January. There's nothing magical about January, but you want to make sure it's reflective of your current interests or your current skill set, and it really describes who you are as a professional. So I think a lot of students, once they hit 16, are beginning to build those profiles.
So, question that's kind of coming up from our audience as we think about, younger and younger folks putting together a professional resume or a profile, they may not have what they think is a lot to put on there. What would you suggest for folks who are kind of figuring out how to translate their skills into the language of the labor market?
So first of all, LinkedIn has a great online tool that is really how to build a LinkedIn profile. When I first built mine years ago, I had to close my office door. It took me 8 hours. No one should be doing that. It should take less than an hour to build a LinkedIn profile. And once you register on LinkedIn, you can look at other folks's, you can look at other people's profiles. So you can look at the CEO of a company that you might be interested in, or a neighbor's profile, or another professional's profile, and get some ideas. And there should be some synergy between a resume and a LinkedIn profile. So the dates should align. Some of the keywords should be very similar. But really, you can build a LinkedIn profile in less than an hour, and you can add to it. It's not like that is a document or a platform, just like your resume that's set in concrete. You can certainly adjust it. You can improve it. You can add keywords.
What is your take on how to actually build a LinkedIn network? Because I know people have different strategies. Like some people just try to amass as many people as possible, even though they don't really know them. Some people are super conservative about who they let into their network, only people they really know. Like what do you suggest here for maybe, I don't know if it differs versus, as you think about different age ranges of job candidates or people on the market, but do you have any suggestions on how to approach that challenge?
So my rule of thumb is to try to add 3 to 5 new connections per week.
Oh, wow.
I think it's much easier if you know those folks face to face. If it's someone's mom or dad or cousin or brother-in-law, that might be a little bit more difficult. You might have to, with your invitation, explain the connection. But I think 3 to 5 connections a week, particularly if you're an active job hunter.
And even if you don't know the people really, just
Just
try.
try. I mean, they may decline, and that's fine. I've declined people. That's okay. But there is, once you send out your invite, there is a little box so you can say, hey, I live on Main Street. I realize that you live on 26 Main Street. I would love to connect. And once that LinkedIn member sees that, they'll often accept.
Yep. Yep. All right, let's kind of actually let's before we move on to the interviewing phase, I would love to just sort of ask you because it's also related to our resumes and our profiles on something like LinkedIn. How do you think about references and how critical are they?
So I think references are important. And when I talked a little, when we talked earlier about some of the unpaid internships, often the value of an unpaid internship is the reference. So references are important. How I like to see references, the same look and feel, the same font as your resume. The reference should be almost part two of what you're revealing to a potential employer. And I suggest 3 to 5 on one sheet of paper, putting your name at the top, putting your phone number at the top. So if it ever gets disconnected from your resume, it's easily married back to your resume. And the person's name, their cell phone, their email, and also maybe most importantly, what the relationship is. If it's a former professor, if it's a high school guidance counselor? Is it a former manager? So that's always helpful.
And are you thinking like a small blurb attached to it at all, or no?
It can be a small blurb. It can be, former professor at Dickinson College. It could be former manager at ABC company.
Oh, I was
Just
wondering is it more like a little bit of a testimonial at all, or is that not what you're talking about?
So I was thinking, and maybe I misinterpreted your question. So I was thinking about the professional references when an employer asks, "Hey, would love to see your
Ah,
references."
yep.
So you're maybe talking about on LinkedIn, those recommendations. I think that they're helpful. They are not a substitute for a phone call or a live dialogue with a former manager or a professor, but certainly we look at them. We look at them all the time.
And then how would you distinguish between, is there any difference between a reference and a referral?
So a reference is typically someone that has worked with the candidate and can speak a little bit to their competencies, their capabilities, their strengths, their weaknesses. A referral is, in terms of the job hunting process, is if I have a candidate and I'm referring them to a friend or a neighbor or to a client, it's really sort of that introduction.
Hmm.
Whereas the reference is really someone who can speak more directly about a candidate's abilities.
Yeah. It's interesting. The folks over at the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation, they do a lot of work on social capital. And I know that they've kind of tried to study the differences between really strong bonds, like those references, and then sort of weak, slightly weaker bonds, like referrals, where you may not know the person as well, but like a seed has been planted in your head where maybe you had coffee with a young intern and you kind of just have their name and their profile in your head and you can kind of refer them to a potential opening. And what they found is that some of those weak links that you would think maybe are not as beneficial as some of these really strong bonds that you have to a former manager are actually quite powerful in thinking about sort of mobility within the workforce. So just another underscoring of your ABN, the always be networking, right? Because even if you don't know the person super well, some of those looser connections can really benefit you, right?
And we see that every day. We see that every day. We will talk to a candidate from 4 years ago and we'll be brainstorming about an opportunity and where to find a candidate. And, we have this tip of the tongue phenomena, and we'll go back and say, wait a second, we presented that candidate 3 or 4 years ago. Who was it? What was the client? And it's not like they're in our immediate 2023 search process. But 2 or 3 years ago, we're trying to reach out to that person and saying, hey, is this something you might be interested in?
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Now on to interviewing. How should we all prepare for interviewing? And, why doesn't winging it work?
I would say winging it almost never works. Preparation can only benefit you. It reduces your nerves. It makes you feel more confident, and it doesn't matter whether it's a video interview, Zoom or Teams, and in person. That preparation is really important. Knowing a little bit about the company. You can use LinkedIn to look at the hiring team. You can talk about, be prepared with questions that you should ask about the company and about the role. I see that you folks just put up a slide. Be prepared about strengths and weaknesses. You will likely get a question about that. One of the things that I often tell typically younger job seekers is to make sure that your social media profiles are clean, and I always say that you'd show them to your mom or your grandmother. And the 30, 60, 90-day plan is critical. One of the pieces of the 30, 60, 90-day is if you're ever identified as a final candidate, and I think we have this in one of the companion documents, that if you're identified as a final candidate and you can put a 30, 60, 90-day plan in the hiring manager's hands, that is a very, very important step that will be very helpful to your candidacy.
So are you saying if you're kind of moving through the rounds and the interviews in one of the deeper rounds to be able to provide one of those is a strong move?
Absolutely. And even during the interview, if you ask, what's most important for me to accomplish in the first 90 days here? You've got really the content for that. And then really the 30, 60, 90-day plan is a very simple, maybe 1, 2, maybe 3-page document, but it certainly shouldn't look like, a War and Peace. It shouldn't be 6 inches thick. And really you're trying to just demonstrate, here's what I can do. Here's what I can accomplish in the first 90 days. And it might not be a perfect document, but certainly you're distinguishing yourself from your competition. It says that you've given the role serious thought, that this is a role that's of great interest to you. It demonstrates some of your organizational skills and your writing skills. So it can be a very powerful tool when someone identifies you as a finalist.
And now we're in the world of, virtual interviews and in-person interviews. Can you talk about the differences and what you would recommend for each channel?
So I would say with the video interviews, whether it be Zoom or Teams, is make sure you're familiar with that before you jump on that virtual interview. Make sure your audio is good. Make sure your video is good. Make sure your background is sort of neutral. And also, I have 2 dogs. I love my 2 dogs, but I don't want to hear someone's dog in the background for sure. So I think those are really important. And then for the in-person, I think you want to map out your route. Make sure you know where you're going. Doing a dry run is important. Dress. I always suggest dress where you want to be, not the role that you're interviewing for. It's better to be a little bit overdressed than a little bit underdressed. If you're not feeling well, please reschedule. No one wants to sit across from a person that is coughing or not feeling well. And making sure that your nonverbals are positive and that you're practicing really good active listening skills. I think those are all important.
Yeah. I wonder how you would describe some of those nonverbal skills in the virtual environment, in the video or web conferencing tools. Like, what would you recommend there?
I think you can still demonstrate really strong nonverbal skills. You can maintain eye contact. You can. One of the things that I love when candidates do is they'll say, you know what, I'm just going to take a few notes here, because to me that demonstrates interest. And it's so sometimes in a Zoom or a video call, it's hard to break away from the face to face. So it's okay if you're on the other side of the screen to say, I'm just going to jot some notes down.
Mm-hmm.
If you didn't explain that, if I was looking down right now, you'd say, what is she distracted by? But it's okay to say, I'm going to jot some notes down, or I'm just looking at my questions to make sure I'm able to ask you some questions at the end. I think that shows engagement.
Yeah. And inevitably at the end of every interview, there's usually the interviewer asking the interviewee, do you have any questions for us? Right.
Absolutely.
And that's a really important time, right? Like that people actually want to hear questions, right?
It demonstrates interest. It shows that you've researched the company, that you're serious about this. And an interview is a two-way street. So it's just as important for that candidate to ask the hiring professional, whether it be a recruiter or a hiring manager, questions. I mean, they expect it. So if a candidate does not have questions, we always pause and say, is this a serious candidate? Are they not interested in this role? Are they unprepared for this role? So you can ask, what's your ideal client like? What are the next steps? I think a great question is, what are the next steps in the interview process? So, but you should certainly go into any interview, whether in person or video, with a list of questions.
Is it okay to ask to record one of these virtual interviews, or is that not something you do?
I've never had anyone do that. I wouldn't be opposed to it. I don't know how other recruiters or hiring managers would feel. Perhaps some would not be comfortable with that, but I would be fine with it.
And there was kind of a moment, as the pandemic was kind of loosening its grip on all of us, where we had a very tight labor market, and we had sort of the Great Resignation also occurring, where people were kind of leaving jobs, and so there was real kind of excitement around hiring. Right, people were desperate to hire talent. What is the job market like these days?
It is still very much an employee candidate job market. When this pandemic hit in first quarter of 2020, unemployment across the US was 14, 15%. That's significant. Our typical unemployment in the US is somewhere between 6 and 8%. Still nationally, we're just above 3%. So it is a fight for talent. And candidates and employees are still sort of what I would call ruling the roost, so to speak.
Yeah, so that they can actually demand a little more maybe, or
They can often demand a little bit more. Companies are still selective. Employers are still very selective. They want to make sure that they hire the right person at the right time for the right role. But we're finding that oftentimes a candidate is looking at multiple offers, and employers have to pay at market and offer some reasonable benefits, whether it be hybrid work, remote work, or even things like tuition aid or medical or benefits like that.
are you finding, with that desire to hire talent, are you finding employers getting a little bit more open about um, maybe the requirements that they're asking for? So are they potentially, widening their aperture in terms of thinking about folks who may not have the precise prior experience, maybe was in sales but is going into a marketing role, or maybe was in business development but kind of wants to do philanthropic fundraising, something like that, right? Where it's not necessarily a clear adjacency, but you can see the connections. Are you seeing employers kind of be open more, or is it still kind of like, no, I need to see 3 years of experience with this?
I think some employers are definitely more flexible about their wish list, their candidate requirements. I think that sometimes a candidate has to really emphasize the transferable skills between those two different roles that are not sort of the traditional career path from a sales associate to a sales rep to a head of sales. But if a candidate can do a really good job of connecting what the transferable skills are and making that apparent and reasonable to an employer, oftentimes an employer will at least consider it.
Yeah. I guess that needs to happen in that cover letter, right?
Cover letter, and also what we've found is that and this sort of gets back to that networking, is that if a hiring manager knows the person and maybe they've worked with them in a prior role, or maybe they went to college with them, or maybe that they are part of some professional association, oftentimes a hiring manager has more flexibility with sort of a known quantity.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there was some past LinkedIn polling or surveying that showed that you were sort of 9 times more likely to get a job through a referral, than just kind of a random
Yep,
electronic submission.
100% agree.
Yeah. So where can we find jobs? What is sort of the job board situation like? What would you recommend?
So I would put above job boards, the networking is even though we've injected technology into the job hunting process, if you look at all the data on how people land jobs, it's still through networking. So I'm going to, live and breathe networking when it's tied to the job hunting process. Secondly, I love LinkedIn. For students, I think Handshake is really important. Um, there are also, job boards like Indeed or Idealist. Idealist tends to gravitate to nonprofits. Lots of people have joined, Meetup, and there are job hunting groups within Meetup, alumni associations, and I think a lot of grads forget, even though they might be 5 or 10 years out of college, that they still can go back to where they went to college, where they maybe completed a certificate, and reconnect with that organization.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I mentioned this idea of social capital, and this sort of this way of building your network is definitely like a kind of asset that you need to be cultivating. And I think maybe it's a little easier for folks who have parents or families that are in these networks, right, in industries that are and are successful, and they have some networks to tap into, to feel like it's okay to ask for help. But I think for folks who are often first generation learners, or minority college students, I think there have been a lot of studies showing that they're not as comfortable. They don't have as much access to that kind of networking, that social capital, and that they also don't know that maybe it's okay to be asking for that help. I'm wondering what you would sort of say to folks as we think about this idea of that you always need to be networking, and why it's okay.
So it's with networking, it is always a tentative ask at the beginning until you develop that confidence. So starting in a very small way with someone that you may have played soccer with a history teacher that you have just developed a really good relationship with. And then, moving on beyond that, maybe it's your school counselor, and maybe it's your principal, and maybe it's the person that coaches soccer for your high school. So it doesn't always have to be a CFO. It always doesn't have to be a person that went to Harvard. Oftentimes it's the person down the street whose dog you might be walking.
Mhm.
And so never sort of always think you have to go to downtown Boston, or somewhere in downtown Chicago and knock on a door of a white glove law firm, because that might not be the best connection for you.
Yep. I love this question from one of our attendees who's asking, what kind of jobs can non-STEM majors or liberal arts grads get in today's economy?
Now, you're talking to a non-STEM person. I already admitted I wasn't that good at chemistry. I didn't do that well in accounting. So there's hope for us. There's hope for us liberal arts folks. So I was a psych undergrad. I think that liberal arts degrees show very well-rounded students. I do think that the internships, some of the summer jobs, even volunteer roles can help you define what you want. You know, if you're really good at Spanish, that's a marketable skill. If you are really good at art, that might be a marketable skill.
Mhm.
Writing, students that can write in a persuasive way, copywriting, those are all huge. And it's really sort of thinking about, it goes back to that, what do I like to do and what do I dislike doing, and also what am I good at, and continuing to develop those skills. So there's lots of hope for liberal arts grads.
Yeah. And I realize that right now the tech sector is doing a fair amount of layoffs, and is kind of a small portion of the labor market. But I think what maybe most people don't understand is how many non-STEM folks actually work in these tech fields. It's actually a pretty incredible amount of liberal arts majors who actually do move into these STEM slash tech companies, and that really important act of also that communication piece, the writing and the actual communication, the oral communication piece is so critical as major companies are trying to bring together, right, their business units alongside their tech and engineering units, and two different silos speaking very different languages. You need someone kind of in the middle serving as that really important kind of liaison. So
Well,
super.
and you look at sales roles, and often
Yeah.
they're not chem majors, they're not accounting majors. You know, we just hired a sales rep that was a French major,
Yeah.
but had very strong communication skills. So
Yep.
don't let a major be a hurdle.
Yeah.
It should benefit you, but don't think just because you're not a business major, just because you're not an IT major, doesn't mean that those fields are off limits to you.
Yep. Yep. What type of mindset is necessary for us entering this kind of new job landscape, right? We know many of us are already experiencing multiple career changes over a lifetime. And I think we've already seen from, the Bureau of Labor Statistics that even our boomers are experiencing on average 12 job changes by the time they retire. So it's not that kind of single career that spans a 40-year, work life. It's a much longer work life potentially, and far more transitions built in. So what kind of mindset would you recommend for our viewers here?
I think flexibility is super important. Being open to, we talked a little bit about volunteer roles. We talked a little bit about um, internships, but also contract roles, whether you're 52 or 16, looking at contract and temp roles, looking at part-time roles, looking at, maybe teach it working in higher ed part-time, and also looking at what I would call a side hustle.
Mhm.
Lots of people sort of are piecing together opportunities and roles that work for them. So it's not always getting a job when after you've done your 4-year degree and you join a firm, and you're not going to be there, in all likelihood, you're not going to be there for 35 years.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've in my own sort of past work as as I've hired teams, I know that, this idea that taking a part-time role can really kind of be that toehold that folks need, right? Like I know I've hired folks as just a part-time person at first, or a freelance contractor, and then realized how incredibly talented and skillful they were and wanted to pull them into the fold even more fully. And so those are really meaningful um, roles to vie for, right?
We have a saying that our clients like to try before they buy.
Yes.
So whether it's 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, filling in, for a leave of absence, filling in for someone who left unexpectedly, those are can be valuable opportunities.
Yeah. So I wanted to touch on something that kind of maybe affects a different portion of our population here, and thinking about reentry challenges. And with the pandemic, we've seen a particularly huge impact on our women at work, right? We've seen women retreat from work just because of the challenges of navigating caregiving alongside work. I'm wondering what kind of advice you would give to a parent who might have taken years off from their careers and is now re-entering and trying to pursue a new career.
So it's very reasonable and okay to say that you took 5 or 8 or 10 years off to focus on your family and raise children. One of the silver linings of this pandemic has been to remove that stigma, because there were many working parents that had to adjust, and maybe they had to scale back their workload. Maybe they had to, remove themselves from the workplace, from the workforce. But that stigma has definitely come down quite a bit. And I think that it is okay for you to take a break from the workplace and come back and explain it, but don't focus on it. I mean, when I coach women on re-entering the workforce, I always say it's okay to explain it. It's okay to talk about that 7-year gap, but really talk about what value they can bring to the company.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you want to address that gap, but you don't want that to be your focus. You don't want to say, well, I have 2 dogs and I have 2 kids, and, my kid had to be dropped off at preschool. Really, an employer is trying to assess what value you can bring. And while that's interesting, what I would suggest is that not to focus on that, but to focus on your web design skills, your administrative skills, your ability to raise, be a fundraiser, your ability to get back into marketing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that should be the focus. Yes, acknowledge it, but don't dwell on it, because really they want, employers are sort of selfish. They want, like, what are you bringing to us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe take those experiences and translate them into those transferable skills that they're seeking for that role, right? Like making it the same language.
Absolutely. Yeah.
For us, for folks who are uncertain of what industry they actually want to land a job in, this came from one of our participants. Do you have any advice on where to begin?
So, I mean, the growth industries, healthcare, biotech, life sciences, technology, those are growing. They're continuing to grow. We hear about layoffs here and there. We're really not seeing it in many of those industries. I know that the Salesforce and the Metas get a lot of attention. Most of our clients are continuing to hire.
Mm-hmm.
So I still think those industries are growth industries. We're also seeing nonprofits continuing to hire. Now, that's not to say that if someone was really interested in higher ed, they shouldn't pursue that. But I would say to broaden the industries to consider. Because once you're sort of just pigeonholed, saying, I just want to work for smaller nonprofits, or I just want to work for higher ed, I think you're limiting your career options.
Yep. And this is kind of a super technical question, but it's come up in our Q&A. How do new college grads answer the salary requirements question that's often on applications? What would you recommend there?
So a couple of different things about compensation. First of all, we are seeing this trend across the U.S. Regarding pay transparency. So I think we see this in New York, we see this in California, where pay is becoming much more of a transparent issue, where even in job postings, in some states, you're required to post a range. Now, in a lot of states, employers cannot ask about your current or your past compensation. They can ask, tell me what you're looking to make. And my best advice to a candidate is to say, total compensation is really important to me. The role is the most important thing to me, but can you give me a sense of the range? Just like when you're buying a house or buying a car, it's always helpful when the other side puts a number on the table. It also gives you a little bit of information about, is the range acceptable to you? Is it not acceptable to you? But you really also have to look at the total comp, the benefits that are part of that, whether is it hybrid? Is it virtual? Is it all of those are factors, but it's always helpful for you to push the company in a very gentle, professional way, saying, can you tell me what the range is? And using an appropriate tone.
Yeah. And I know you had kind of briefly mentioned this when we went over it earlier. You had mentioned kind of clean up or tidy up your social media profiles. I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about that and whether employers and hiring managers are actually taking a look at folks' social media profiles to understand what they're saying there, and how do you actually potentially clean that up? Or for someone who maybe is fearful of what that might entail, like what would you recommend here?
So my guideline is, and I think I jokingly said this before, if you're okay showing your mom or your grandmother or an aunt, that's sort of a good test. If you're not okay with your mom, your grandmother, your aunt, or an uncle sort of examining your social media, then we might have a problem. There shouldn't be, and I always say it should be PG-13 or cleaner. So, we don't want to see spring break photos. We don't want to see, your wildest parties on a Saturday night. We want, and employers are looking. Employers are absolutely looking at TikTok and Instagram and Facebook and all of those sites. You can sort of button them down with privacy controls. However, there are really smart people, especially technology companies, that seem to be able to take a backdoor and be able to look at things. So better to clean things up in advance of a job hunt.
People are massively deleting right now.
Right.
One question actually that came up sort of as a bolt on to your answer around the salary requirement or the salary question in certain online postings, you can't actually ask what is the range. So what would you recommend there?
So you can go on sites, and now ranges are much more common. So if you look in New York or California or Colorado, they're required to post ranges, so you can get some good data. Glassdoor is another resource where you can go on and look for data. PayScale is another site that often you can put in information. Salary.com is another site. And a lot of these, if you look at one data point, that is not always an indicator, but if you look at 3 or 4 data points and they're all within $10,000, you probably know that the range is somewhere between, if you find one at 62 and one at 68 and one at 65, that's probably a pretty reasonable range to assume.
Mm-hmm. And maybe another one of those times when you ask some of those folks in your network, right? And you just kind of quickly gauge.
Well, and I had made this comment earlier about LinkedIn. If you have a connection that works at that company that's on LinkedIn, and finding them and reconnecting with that person and saying, hey, I saw this marketing manager posted. Can you give me a sense of what the range is? And they may be able to give you a reasonable range for that role.
Yeah. Well, Pattie, we have taken up so much of your time. Thank you so much for all of these tips and tricks and to-dos and not to-dos. Just really appreciate your joining us. Thank you so much.
It has been a pleasure.
So thanks everyone for watching How to Land a Job from College Guidance Network. Our next career program is going to be on Thursday, April 13th at the same time at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. And my Michael Horn will actually be joining me as a co-host, and we're going to be discussing job pathways. And we're going to have two guests that evening. One is Kathy Davies, who is the managing director of the Stanford Life Design Lab, and Sheila Saram, who's the CEO and founder of BASTA, which specializes in career navigation for first-gen college students. And there's a link, there should be a link in the chat to register. We welcome your feedback on today's episode, and we hope that you will use the survey that you see in the chat. And by filling it out, you'll actually be entered into a drawing to receive a $50 Amazon gift card. A link to the recorded version of this program will be available later, as well as a companion resource, and it's going to be sent out to everyone who participated next week so that you can share it with others. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.